What it do, y'all? Chase Taylor here with another edition of Tailor-Made Macro, where we let others stay on top of markets while we try and get to the bottom of them, and we focus on how to think instead of what to think. My guest today is my friend Jacob Shapiro from Cognitive Investments and the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, which will be renamed soon after the man himself. Jacob and I were introduced years ago by our mutual friend Sune Sorensen, who is the head of asset management for Bespoke. I'm thankful that Sune put us together because Jacob's a great guy, a great thinker, a great geopolitical analyst, and someone I plan to have on regularly because, like me, Jacob thinks not just about outcomes and forecasts, but thinks about the basics of how to think, how to read, how to research, which we'll get a great primer on in this episode. Just like in the investment world, geopolitical analysis is full of blowhards and gurus who are often wrong and never in doubt. But Jacob is open about what he gets wrong and happy to explore the other side of his views with rigor. In a world of clickbait and 30-second videos, Jacob's well-researched and thought-out views on the world of politics are refreshing, as I hope you will see after today's interview. As always, if you manage your own money or just enjoy markets, give my research a try at pineconemacro.com. And if you prefer someone else to manage your money, check out Bulwark Capital Management, where I'm the head of research at bulwarkcapitalmgmt.com to learn more. All the views expressed by myself and my guests are just our opinions and are not investment advice or anything that resembles investment advice. All right, on to the show. First question for you. Do you have a charity for us? Because if you say good question or any derivative of, you get that and we will donate $10 each to your charity.
That's amazing. So it'll be personal. So you probably know, Chase, that my dad passed away in December, and there's a scholarship at Oxford College of Emory University being set up in his and my mother's honor to allow first-generation American citizens to go to college. So it's the William and Anne Monroe Shapiro Endowment, and I'll try I'll try to raise as much as I can for it.
Let's not fill the whole podcast up with it, but that's one where even if you don't make the mistake, we're going to give some money to that regardless. That's awesome. I'm glad that's a thing. So I want to spend a little time on geopolitics and markets, but I really want to go deeper than any listener is going to try to suffer through probably on like your reading and research process, because I care, and it's my show, damn it. So let's start pure geopolitics. And this is kind of a natural question from the last couple of weeks. And that is, I want your take on the elections in India, Mexico, and South Africa. I mean, like for the countries in general, but of course the investment implications of each. Start with whichever one you want, but this will probably not get released for a couple of weeks. So no pressure to not say anything dumb that will age poorly. Good luck.
The first thing I would say, and this gets to your question about process, I would caution anyone taking any conclusion from all three of them. They're all completely different with completely different dynamics. So I've already seen the sort of, authoritarians on the downswing or populism on there's nothing that we can do across here. The only thing I will say is that these are three countries that in a more multipolar world, their geopolitical fundamentals are good. Like their geography is good, their populations are generally good. Like they have a lot of things going for them. But after that, I'm not going to generalize at all. I think the easiest one for me to start with is Mexico. And it's the one where I think I have the most contrarian point of view right now. And you've probably noticed this, Chase, but pick up a newspaper in any English language media, and the coverage of Mexico is going to be cartels murdering people, Cinco de Mayo, and dictators taking over Mexico. And that's it. That's the level of depth that we have in English language about Mexico. And it's just not true. And all the things they said about Shienbaum, or all the things they're saying about Shienbaum today, they were saying about AMLO when he was elected, that he was going to be the Trump of the tropics, that he was going to usurp the Mexican Constitution, that he was never going to relinquish power. And they didn't bother to actually listen to what AMLO was saying, and didn't bother to understand why he has sky-high approval ratings. He has approval ratings that any U.S. president would kill for, even at the end of his presidency. Now, the reason he has high approval ratings, and that Morena has high approval ratings, and that Shienbaum will have high approval ratings, is because these are people who really take the fight against corruption seriously. Before you had AMLO, you had the Peña Nieto administration, and it was one of the most corrupt administrations in modern Mexican history, which is really saying something. So both Shienbaum and AMLO have their own idiosyncratic positions, but the one thing that people believe in them about is that they are trying to fight corruption, that they are not bought by the system. And that, I think, gives them a lot of leeway. The second thing I would just say here is that Mexico, it's a classic case of globalization. NAFTA gave it a massive shot in the arm in terms of overall wealth, but it drastically exacerbated wealth inequality within the country itself, and the country was already pretty unequal to start with. And the policies that AMLO pushed were about reducing wealth inequality fundamentally. And the thing that I think is so optimistic about Shienbaum is she is not as ideological as AMLO. She is a scientist. Go look at her Google Scholar page. She's written like 40 really dry papers about environmental engineering and things like that. All of which is to say she doesn't think about things from that ideological populist point of view that AMLO does. She thinks about things in terms of science, in terms of hypotheses, and do one thing and it gets proven into the next thing, which is why she reminds me of Angela Merkel and why she might be the best of all worlds here, because she's not for corruption. She has some of those priorities at the population level, but she doesn't have AMLO's crazy, state control over the oil economy or pushing the oil economy over the renewable potential that Mexico has, especially when it comes to lithium and copper and all these things that Mexico is sitting on top of. She is not going to go bring amulets to Washington to try and win over Donald Trump. Like, she's going to do a lot of different things in ways that mean things better. So from my point of view, it's a positive that she was elected. It's a positive that Morena was elected with what looks like almost a supermajority. So they are going to have a supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies. It looks like today they won't have the supermajority in the Senate. And you need the supermajority in both houses to pass all of these constitutional changes that might make me more afraid of Mexican politics in the short run. Even if Morena had the supermajority, I like Mexico in the long run. Like I said, the geopolitical fundamentals, whether it's a young and developing labor economy, proximity to the United States. For the first time since Santa Anna, Mexico has some leverage over the United States because of its importance to the United States in terms of nearshoring. Like, all of these things make me feel fundamentally positive about Mexico, even if they had elected some crazy person and Moreno was going to take the country into a very strange direction. So I'm very, very optimistic about Mexico, and nothing that I saw in this election result made me less optimistic. I don't know if you want to pause there, or I can do rapid fire
Yeah,
through India and South Africa.
we are recording on June 6th. So as Jacob mentioned, like, it looks like maybe not supermajority on the upper chamber side. It's been kind of like the headlines have gone back and forth like the last few days. So that's what it looks like now. But even if that's the case, it might be able to negotiate their way to an effective one, or they'll actually have one. So it'll be interesting to see how the next like week goes. But I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. And one note, I think I learned as much about Santa Anna in school as I learned about George Washington as a native Texan. So that was a nice drop in there.
Yeah, I try.
Yeah, let's go India.
India, and you and I have talked about India before. I'm so ambivalent about India. I cannot make up my mind about whether they're going to take over the world or completely collapse in on themselves. And I change my mind depending on the day of the week. Ultimately, I actually think my business partner, Rob Laherty, has the best quip about India, which is that quantity has a quality all of its own. And in the same way that Mexico has geopolitical fundamentals that will pull it no matter what the politics is there, India has a billion young people who, GDP per capita at India is relatively at the same level as Haiti. That's how poor we're talking the population is in general. And there's a billion of them, and they're up and coming. When Narendra Modi first came into office, he promised that by the time he left office, every Indian would have a toilet in their home. That's the level of development we're talking here with India. We're talking about a country where 100% of people don't have indoor plumbing. So if you just get air conditioners and toilets and whatever else in every single house in India, you're talking about a massive boom sort of in the consumer economy and everything else in general. The election result looks about how I expected. Modi is still incredibly popular, but there are limits to how far his personal charisma can lend itself to the BJP party. He is trying to author this switch to Hindu nationalism. And again, I've always debated with myself, is that a top-down thing that he's trying to apply, or is that a bottoms-up groundswell of something changing within India itself? And everything I think we've seen under the Modi government says that it's probably more of a top-down thing, that India is so diverse that no one person is ever going to be able to tame it. and that you really have to think of India in terms of these regional centers. So, for instance, southern India, that's where a lot of this tech development and manufacturing is going to happen. Northern India might be the places where either advances or deteriorations in ag happen. It can kind of, it's on a knife's edge, it can go either way. And then there are other parts of India. If we go further east, I would want no parts of that are, that aren't probably going to have toilets in their houses by the end of the Modi government. So it's a mixed bag, and I think one of the things it tells us is that I think it's a confirmation note for this idea that Modi's charisma is its own thing, and that there are limits to how far his charisma can inject itself into the BJP. And the really interesting thing here will be, this is Modi's third term. He's not going to live forever. He's not going to be president or leader forever. Who's next in the BJP? Are they going to have charisma, or are we going to see that backward swift to Congress and sort of a pushback against some of these things in general? By the way, if you had that pushback, that might actually be better, because Modi has been, it's not just Hindu nationalism, it's also self-reliance in everything. So India could reap massive gains if it wanted to make itself the sort of free trade, where alternative to China bastion in sort of the Western world. It hasn't wanted to do that. It's wanted to be its own thing. It's wanted to build its own data centers and its own 5G companies and its own semiconductor giants and things like that. If you get a move back which says less nationalism, less chauvinism, less protectionism, might actually sort of be more interesting for the population in general.
And speaking of toilets, what do you think about the South African election?
South Africa is a lot harder to parse. And of the three countries that we just talked about, like for me, South African politics are the worst, which might surprise some listeners, because you think Mexico and you think cartels and high murder rates and all the migration and things like that. You think India and you think 25% Muslim population. But for me, it's South Africa that the politics worry me the most, because apartheid is still fresh. It's not like that society has healed itself or congealed into anything that we would think of as a healthy, functioning society. It's still sort of hopelessly paired against each other. It's probably a net positive that the African National Congress, the ANC, now finally is not the majority. It's not just going to dine off on the coattails of previous accomplishments. It's going to actually have to govern and make compromises and maybe build some of that socioeconomic cohesion, whereas before, just sort of the spirit of Mandela and the end of apartheid carried it to a majority at all times. But that's very speculative at this point. And South Africa has shown none of the ability to do that itself. That said, South Africa, like Mexico and India, in some ways more so than both of those countries, has tremendous geopolitical advantages. Geographically, it's far away from a lot of the geopolitical hotspots in the world. It is sitting on all sorts of mineral resources that you need in the world, more so than any other country in Africa, even with all the political problems I just talked about, a much better sense of the rule of law and things like that than anywhere else you're going to get in sub-Saharan Africa. So it has some things going for it, but we're very early innings here. So until we see some signs that the ANC is going to change, or there is something resembling cohesion or a sense of South African national identity, I think it's always going to be tripping over itself and probably not living up to what its potential should be on paper.
So I've one follow-up there, and that's mostly because I haven't paid attention the last couple of days. Have we seen any leaning at all on who they will form a coalition government with, or is that all completely up in the air here on June 6th?
On June 6th, the horse trading continues.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just hadn't read anything the last couple of days.
I will say that, it's a good question, though, because one of the positives out of this is that the horse trading...
Gotcha.
Well, this is great. Go me. It's a really good gimmick. What was I? Oh, but the thought has now completely gone out of my mind. It probably wasn't that important. So it wasn't actual. Yeah. Anyway,
you're welcome.
Oh, I know what I was going to say.
There you go.
There hasn't been a lot of violence. The concern was that there was going to be violence in the context of the election, that Jacob Zuma was going to activate, his acolytes, and there was going to be all this violence around the election. At least here on June 6th, that's not what we're saying. The political process is functioning the way that it should function. So maybe that's an early indication that that it's the beginning of a change.
Fair enough. When you think about impactful world leaders that you think other people overlook, who would you say is pound for pound the most important versus how you think they're followed in the US?
Hmm. The first thing I'll say is
No
that
Shienbaum.
if the first thing I'll say is that if you've been following my work for a while, you know that my career started at Stratfor in the sort of George Friedman universe, and George and I, like philosophically, diverged in a lot of different directions. But one of the ones that is most stark is that, and this is true of Peter Zeihan too. George and Peter and even Marco Papich, that class of geopolitical analysts, do not think the individual matters at all. So for that, they would answer your question by saying, doesn't matter what the leaders are.
Right.
That's a distraction. We shouldn't be chasing those things. I think that is not the case. I think that individuals have a tremendous amount of agency or can have a tremendous amount of agency. Now, it depends on the right moment. It depends on the political structure. It depends on that country having enough power in and of its own right to have a leader who can express those sorts of things. But I think you can get leaders who are incredibly impactful. Um, I wouldn't say he's a particularly good leader, but a good example of what I'm talking about here is Vladimir Putin. I don't think Russia invades Ukraine unless Vladimir Putin is the guy who is doing things. I had a friend who was working for, I can't share what country it was, but he was staffing a visit to Russia before Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the leader of a country. And he talked about how, they sat across that really absurdly long table from Putin, and he said the meeting went about 3 to 4 hours, and that for 90% of the meeting, Putin was lecturing them about 19th and 18th century Russian history. So if you didn't have that man with that viewpoint, with those sort of, that level of power underneath him, like, you probably don't get a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's like the wind up in the preamble to what I'm about to say. I think the candidate that has always sort of, well, there's a couple here. I mean, we could definitely talk about Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping gets treated like, a neo Mao type figure when he's actually far more interesting than that. His father suffered mightily at the hands of the Cultural Revolution and at Mao. She has, indelible memories about what that was like as a young person. He was also not. He's not somebody who was the first choice of the establishment. He was a compromise candidate that all the different factions could agree on because they thought they could control him. And then suddenly he emerges and he is what he is today, which is, it's Mao and Deng Xiaoping, and it's going to be Xi Jinping, and that's going to matter for China's future. And I've always had I think he's a really interesting figure, and I think he's much more multifaceted than the West really gives him credit for. Anytime you trot out the Mao thing or even the authoritarian thing, like, that's not who that guy is. And in a same way that AMLO is popular with Mexico is because he was tackling corruption, Xi is popular with the normal Chinese person because he tackled corruption. He's tackling the coast. He's thinking about redistributing wealth. So he's one. Um, the other, I mean, Milei is one that, like, comes to mind that we could discuss sort of as a joke, but sort of seriously. But the other one that I really spend a lot of time thinking about is Emmanuel Macron. And he's sort of a terrible politician. And the only reason he's president of France is because, the person that he was going up against both times had the last name Le Pen. If she had changed her name or just let somebody else in the French right run, like, I doubt that Macron would have actually pulled it through. But his strategic instincts are correct. He's been calling for European sovereignty and a stronger EU and all this other stuff since day one in office. And I think he sees the end of his presidency coming, and he wants to make some facts on the ground that a future Le Pen or some other person couldn't just so easily reverse. But he's the brain in Europe, and I think whether Europe sort of falls apart into a bunch of bickering states or actually some kind of cohesive European entity emerges, I think it's really on his shoulders and in his ability to convince the Germans and the other European states to go along with them. So Xi and Macron were the first two that came to my mind. But we could talk Millet if you want to, take some metaphorical mushrooms and get real weird here.
So yeah, no, let's do it because you have this real time experiment with hardcore like austerity and stuff. Like a lot of people in the US say like, oh, let's balance the budget, not realizing the damage that it does to real growth, at least in the in the short term, and to probably employment. And he has actually largely balanced the budget since he took power. But now if you look at a chart of like industrial production or something, it is, I mean, it's going straight down. So like the pain part of his policies are about to insert themselves. So how much can the public take? How much can he take? Can he can he move the legislature at all? Like all that stuff becomes super interesting for the next year. So, well, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, the interesting thing about him in that context is that so Argentina was already experiencing the pain with the previous policies. When you've got runaway inflation like that and hyperinflation knocking on the door, like so you have Milei's pain and you have the pain of what was there before. So it's sort of a do you want to die by drowning or die by fire sort of thing. It's also one of the reasons Argentina's in this position is because it's never taken the pain. It's never taken the recession. It's never taken the write down. Like it's always been, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I think the fact that he won as Looney Tune as he is, and he's bonkers, probably tells you right there that the Argentine population was fed up and that they are willing to tolerate some pain if it means there's going to be change coming forward. Now, for all of his lunacy, he has shown himself to be a pretty savvy and pragmatic um, operator. He's already got the lower house agreeing to a sort of slimmed down version of his omnibus bill that would give him expanded powers. And it sounds like he's making progress getting the upper house to come along too. So if he can get the upper house to pass it, and if he can give himself some real executive powers here over the next year or two, to really bring the pain, like it's we're not even close to the pain. Like it's going to have to get a lot more painful before things get better in Argentina, and he's going to need power in order to see that through. If he can make enough wheeling and dealing to get to that point, then maybe this is sort of, equivalent to Brazil 94, 95. And in 20, 30 years, we'll be talking about this as the turnaround moment of Argentina. I would also just point out that's the bull case. The bull case is that this is Brazil 94, 95. And that in 20 years, like we will be talking about Argentina sort of among, one of the fastest growing among the world's elite. There is a lot of pain that is going to have to happen before things get better here in Argentina. The last thing I'll just say is that separate from all of that, and it's sort of well timed, and you know this better than anybody else. You were early on this. I mean, Argentina has a shale revolution of its own. It's an agricultural superpower. I mean, it's got a lot of stuff going for it in terms of resources. And if you can unshackle the economy, yeah, maybe your manufacturing, all these other things go down. But like you can get hard currency into that country, especially because like the weather, I mean, who knows? The weather can be really bad, but they had some of the worst weather the past couple of years that they've ever had. So odds are that it's probably going to revert, and they're probably going to be a big ag exporter, and they've got their shale stuff going, so they can export that. So maybe there'll be some more hard currency in the coffers to make the pain a little bit less salient. But I think ultimately it comes down to can Milei wheel and deal, and can he amass enough executive authority to make this truly painful? Because Argentina needs pain before it's going to get better.
Yeah, and I think on the geopolitical side, something interesting, and this is very very speculative, but he is very much cozied up to the U.S. vis-a-vis China, and he's you think about people like the IMF, they're a fan of what he's putting together. So what that makes me think is like if this works and if it works really well, and obviously that's not going to be easy to pull off, but if it works really well, the whole like, hey, let's cut spending and handouts and everything, and let's kind of do this the lean down government version way. Um, the natural potential in that place is so huge that you could have a real success story. So if you do, is there a bit of like a domino theory kind of situation in Latin America or even in the emerging world writ large where people see his success and try to emulate it?
That's a difficult question to answer. My instinct is no, that very few countries have the resources and the advantages that Argentina has. So, like, Argentina is going to have more tools in the toolkit than most other countries are going to have. But I do think you actually made a really important point, which is previous Argentine governments have tried to play China and the United States off of each other and have honestly leaned more towards China. And you're right that Milei is leaning more towards the United States. But I think that would be a policy mistake. And it's a policy mistake that Brazil, in some ways, is making in the opposite direction. If you look at Brazil's trade, I mean, it's getting more and more and more dependent on China. And this is why Mercosur is falling apart. This is why Latin America, I think, is punching below its weight. Because I'm bullish Brazil, but the more Brazil becomes dependent on trade with China, the more my thesis gets invalidated. Because what South America really needs to get to what you're talking about, it needs to trade more with each other. It needs to be an integrated market of itself and create economies of scale within Latin America and then go out rather than just be this depot for the commodities that everybody else in the world wants. So like to get success, I think in the way that you're phrasing it, I think Argentina actually has an opportunity because Brazil really isn't thinking this way yet. If they can think of, okay, we are going to be the ones who are going to create an internal market in Latin America. We want the economy of scale. We want to be the first mover that does those things because Brazil is not doing it. I would sit up in my chair and say, well, that really could spread throughout sort of Central America and South America. The other model, I mean, the back end of your question, like Milei is so early and so speculative, and Argentina is so unique that it's sort of hard to apply anything. I think what El Salvador is doing is more interesting in that regard because that's a blueprint that other countries could follow. It just requires a dictator. So.
Yeah, big prisons help. So last question before we go to Between Two Pines, so I can have some fun at your expense. So which country ETF do you think is most mispriced and why? And so I mean like cheapest versus its potential.
Well, we're recording on June 6th. So 2 days ago, my answer was Mexico, and I was buying hand over fist. And I do think that I almost want there to be a supermajority because then there'll be a market freak out and it'll drop again. And I'll want to pile back in, whether it's Mexican equities or ETFs and things like that. So that Mexico is one that I'm sort of constantly looking at. The Brazil ETF, I think, is mispriced, but it's mispriced for good reason, because if it were really a reflection of the Brazilian economy, it would be doing much better. The problem is that basically every Brazilian ETF I've seen, and this is true of the iShares one too, it's like 15, 20% Vale. So we're really talking about iron ore and Chinese infrastructure rather than like what's going on in Brazil. So that's another one. And then the third, it pains me to say this, but I think Saudi Arabia is interesting. And it pains me to say it because I have not been a fan of Saudi Arabia and I'm not a fan of Mohammed bin Salman, but I sort of have to put my personal views to the side here because they are sitting on the cheapest oil resources in the world. And it does seem like some things are happening at a societal level that is changing in Saudi Arabia, and that they really, there are the boondoggles and the soccer teams and the golf and the ships and everything else, but there's also movie theaters going up and there's women are going to school. Yes, it's segregated, but women are going, like, they're doing things that really are interesting that I didn't think were possible. So that's my list to look at a little bit more: Brazil, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, we are fans of the Gulf states here, so I kind of like your answer. All right, time for Between Two Pines. So, you are a hooper on the streets of New Orleans, but you are also a Cornell Glee Club guy. Mm-hmm. What makes you feel most alive? Hitting a game-winning fadeaway in some fool's face, or nailing a B2 note singing your heart out?
The Cornell University Glee Club, making moms cry since 1868. I'm going to try and punt and tell you that there's nothing like a game-winning fadeaway. But the reason I like basketball and the reason I liked singing in the Cornell Glee Club was because those are team environments. And basketball is at its most fun. I would rather be the guy who's getting the rebound and like sending the pass up for the last second shot. Like that's a more realistic role for me than that I'm going to take the fadeaway jumper that's going to go in and I'm going to feel like it's teamwork. In the same way, the thing about the Glee Club was when you're doing that kind of singing, it's bad if you stand out. Like you try to make 20 voices sound like one voice. So it's actually really sort of incredible if you get into a beautiful like chapel and you can like hear everything ringing in your head and everybody is sort of doing the same thing at the same time and it works. It can be really bad. The answer that I have better for you is that it's much more painful to be in a singing group where that's not happening than it is to be like on a basketball court where there's a ball hog, because like you expect people to be ball hogs and stuff like that, but like if you're in the beautiful chapel and there's one guy who's like off or like it's just not working, it's really depressing. So how's that for an answer?
I think that might be the best Between Two Pines answer yet.
I should also tell you, I should also tell you, Chase, before we leave that for 2 years in a row I was the Omega of the Cornell University Glee Club, which is to say I had the lowest voice in the entire group, which was great joy for me because you can't tell now. I was a boy soprano, and I got bullied mercilessly as a young kid because of how high my voice was. And I sort of skipped the whole puberty stage. Like it went from super, super high to this like overnight. And so while all these like bullies like were having their voices crack, I was just over here like, slinging smooth honeyed voices and stuff like that.
James Earl Jones on them.
Exactly.
You are a New Orleans Pelican fan, is that right?
Well, yes, that's complicated. So I was an Atlanta Hawks fan, and then the day that the Hawks traded Luka Doncic for Trae Young and a draft pick that I believe became Cam Reddish, I publicly announced that I was changing my allegiance because I just couldn't take it anymore.
You just keep, just taking my jokes out at the knees. I was going to make a big Pelicans joke, but you really defended that too well for me to make a joke.
Oh, you can make a Pelicans joke. Like, please go.
I was just going to say that's the whole joke. The Pelicans. Next question. While you live in the Crescent City, you're a rock star in the Midwest, like the Elvis of the cornfields of Iowa or the Taylor Swift of the Wisconsin dairies. When the Civil War starts next year, can I trust you to lead the Midwest into a golden era of independence, and can I be the supreme leader of Cleveland?
If a civil war breaks out next year, you can find me reclaiming my Austrian citizenship from my grandparents and holding court in Vienna. You are more than welcome to come and have.
We have to conquer the Midwest. All right. Last question: who is the most accurate geopolitical forecaster, and why is it Peter Zeihan? You don't have to answer that.
No, I thought these were supposed to make fun of me. Who is the most accurate geopolitical forecaster? It really depends what you're forecasting, because some of us are forecasting market performance, and some of us are thinking about supply chains, and some of us are just writing books or selling Substacks subscriptions and things like that. The answer to your question is, and I've said this before, and this is not a cop-out, but I don't know, and that's not the point of geopolitics. Like, that's the trap.
Yep.
It's not about, like, I hope I get everything right. And I think the fact that I've been able to make a living doing this means I'm right more often than I'm not. But I always say to all of my clients, whether it's in the consulting realm or in the finance realm, I didn't do my job right if something happens that we didn't imagine, that we didn't think was possible. Okay, then I've like truly failed you. But am I going to get everything right? Of course not. If I was accurate as I hope to be, I wouldn't be selling my services, and I wouldn't be on this podcast. I'd be in the South Pacific with little drinks with little umbrellas in them in a hut that's named after my grandparents' home or something like that. Like that's the thing. So geopolitics really is more about defining possibilities and getting ready for any possibility, so that if the crazy thing happens, I've thought about it before and I know what I'm going to do when that happens, rather than I'm going to perfectly be able to identify the scenario. So if a geopolitical analyst is out there like Peter, who I worked with and I have a lot of respect for, but like Peter, who is saying, hey, this is what's going to happen, I'm sorry, like, you're really just sort of selling books. You're not actually doing the work, which is not nearly as interesting as calling moonshots like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I make a joke at Peter's expense for his $1 trillion wheat call, things like that. But I do really enjoy his work. I just kind of understand where it's coming from.
Peter is so good at thinking of the worst case possibility. Whenever I start a project or I always look to see if Peter has done something on it, because he has a better imagination than I do. He can imagine what the zombie apocalypse looks like in a way that I absolutely can't. He has two problems. Number one, he usually takes a worst case scenario and makes it the most likely scenario. And number two, and this is the one where I actually have sort of an axe to grind with him, and I hope one day that I'll get a chance to debate him in a respectful setting. But when he's wrong, he doesn't raise his hand and say I was wrong. And there are a lot of people who rely on his analysis to make decisions about their businesses or about what price they sell their commodities at and things like that. And so it starts to border on irresponsibility if you're not going to be the first one that raises your hand that you're wrong. I'll give you a tangible example here. He was one of the only geopolitical analysts out there. He might be the only one that I can think of who said Russia was going to invade Ukraine when it did. I didn't think it was going to happen. We were long the Russia ETF, rest in peace, when it happened, because we thought the risk reward was interesting. But I'm actually proud of that moment, because the moment that Putin did that National Security Council whatever thing, I called all of our guys together and I said, sell the position now. And they were like, nah, let's see how it goes for a day or two. The chart looks good. And I was like, no, sell the position now. And Russian stock markets closed 2 days later. So I was really happy that I was able to make that change. Whereas look at every single call Peter has made about Russia and Ukraine since the invasion. Basically, they've all been wrong. You talked about the wheat one. The one I remember was that Russian oil production was going to cease within 6 months or something like that. Like,
Right.
and he doesn't raise the hand and say, hey, like, we got to go on to the next thing. So jokes aside, like that's I think the problem with trusting his analysis too much, but there's definitely utility in it.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that is way more important for market analysts, market practitioners than the average market, practitioner puts into their process, and that is imagination. Like, I, the market is such a left brain dominated, analytically driven thing that most people don't have much creativity or imagination, and it's one of the reasons I've enjoyed foresight education. Becoming a
Mhm.
trained futurist is you're literally just trained to imagine crazy stuff from the future, and work back to now and try to like see which of those things kind of start to stick so you can follow them and be more ready than other people. So if you're a market practitioner and you're just looking at spreadsheets all day, I I promise you you're missing things, and you should go grab some sci-fi and start thinking about how things can be wildly different 5-10 years from now, whether that's geopolitics, markets, whatever it is.
Well, not only that, I mean, this has always been true of the human condition, but social media makes it so much worse. We don't like to feel like we're truly contrarian. And every good geopolitical call I've made that was correct, where I got the prediction right, was one where I was ridiculed, told I was crazy, like even had clients like hang up on me and like call me back 6 months later. Like, analysis, no matter what it is, it's actually a really lonely business because you have to get to something that you really can sort of put your shoulder behind, and then you got to stick with it even while everybody else is telling you that you're crazy. So I actually usually get nervous when I say something and then I see it's out there like 5 or 6 different times. It's actually one of the reasons my conviction on this Mexico thing is so strong. Like I'm out there over my skis completely alone. Nobody else has been saying it. Like, okay, good. Like I'm happy to be there.
Yep, that's definitely how it works in the markets very often, and it's because it's hard to do that. All right, so what I really want to drill on here, it goes back to an episode of your podcast, Cognitive Dissidence, which was the depreciable line of information. It was such a good episode, and we'll put it in the show notes. I emailed you right after, and honestly, like it helped inspire this podcast. You guys went deep on something nobody really talks about, but everyone who's a serious analyst struggles with, and that's the actual practice of reading, researching, and thinking. My taglines for this show are: we stay on top of markets, we let others stay on top of markets while we try and get to the bottom of them. I say we're the least actionable macro podcast, and then we go we go deep on how to think, not what to think. All this stuff is like was captured in that episode with you and Rob. Um, the core of the episode revolved around the information pyramid, which, the big base at the bottom is like deep work, long form work. And then the top is the lower ROI information, like, reading the news and social media and whatever today's data points were. Um, so this podcast for me is like a mantra where I'm repeating all these things because I'm trying to make myself more like that, because I am not always good at it. So reading the bottom of the pyramid, the evergreen stuff, instead of holding my magnifying glass up to the front page of the paper. So what I want you to do is tell me how you go about balancing this, and like literally how you do, because I know it's the same struggle for you. And which type of information you hold in your process, and how you go about keeping, the main thing, and sticking in that bottom of the pyramid as much as possible.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a joy to be comprehended when it comes to like our focus on this sort of thing, because it's the stuff that really separates, I think, analysts that are trying to figure out what's actually going on versus people who are just selling a book or something like that. Um, I come at this from an intelligence background, which is not to say I don't work for any agencies and never have. But I started my career at Stratfor, and Stratfor trained you sort of in intelligence methods. And it's not that they taught me how to tie a bow tie and put on a tuxedo and drink martinis. I learned how to do that in the Cornell University Glee Club. Um, but what it taught you was how to read and how to think. If any of your listeners, if you want an old movie that really captures this, 3 Days of the Condor with a young Robert Redford. He's a CIA agent who gets caught up in something, but he's in like an office, and I forget what city he's based in, but just faxes are coming in all the time, and his entire job is to read the faxes because they're reports from different places all around the world, and he's supposed to call someone if one of the faxes seems a little bit weird. That's his job as a CIA analyst, and sort of that. So that's sort of the intelligence background that I come from. You are trying to read as much as you possibly can. And then the other part of this, it goes back to you talking about imagination. In order to be able to find something that doesn't fit or that is strange or that merits further attention, you do have to have a sense of what's going on in the world and what you expect to happen. So that's why for me, like forecasts are entirely heuristic. Like, yes, I want to get them right. But what I really need to do is I need to be able to tell myself, this is what I expect to happen, so that if something happens that is way way outside the bounds of what I'm expecting, I know to stop and say, okay, something here is not quite right, and I really need to do due diligence on this. The guy who trained me at Stratfor was primarily Roger Baker, and he said two things about this. The first was 9 out of 10, probably 99 out of 100 times, the piece of info that you pick up that seems strange is probably not going to be important. It was a lazy reporter, or it was just like it wasn't actually that important, but you're looking for that sort of one time where it really makes a difference. He also told me this great story once about how he was putting together a report, and he had a hypothesis that three different things were connected, that there was causality between three disparate events that had happened. And somebody showed up at his office asking where he got access to confidential information after he published his theory. And he was like, I didn't have access. I just thought that like all of the events themselves were available in the open source. Like you could have gotten them for free. What was quote unquote confidential was the causality behind them. And he was able to hypothesize that without actually sort of getting access to the secret sort of beneath it all. So I'm always like looking for that sort of thing. So in terms of brass tacks, what that looks like, I have 150 or 200 websites. I cycle through like 15 or 20 that I read every single day that are mostly, you know, local publications in the languages that are in the countries that I'm interested in. And I'm either Google translating, or if it's a language I can fool around and I'm trying to read them. And I try to read the whole thing. I put the ones that I think are interesting into a database, and I tag them by importance and category. And I write a little note to myself why I thought it was worthy of tagging. And then I go back through that and I sort of cipher, okay, I either give it a 1, 2, or a 3 in terms of importance rating. So a 3 is, okay, this is like background noise, but it should be here. 2 is like, I need to get down to the bottom of this by the end of the week. And 1 is stop everything that you're doing and figure this out before we go any further. So everything sort of gets given a ranking like that. Um, and then you go from there, and it's rinse and repeat, and then you're constantly having to add new websites or take websites down that are either shut down or government authorities are going after them, things like that. The last part of this, because I'm rambling a little bit, but I'll just say that one of the
No, this is
challenges
perfect.
here one of the challenges here, and especially for the way I was taught to parse information, is that for most of human history, the problem with intelligence was you didn't have enough information. You were out there trying to find more information. That has changed in the last 30 years. Now there's too much information, and you are trying to find sort of the diamonds in the rough. So it actually makes a career like mine a lot more possible because 50 years ago, no, you needed the CIA agent in the country of record to like find out what was going on. Whereas now it's like, no, like let me see if I can parse through all of this stuff, social media, whatever else is going on. Can I sort of parse and find the thing that doesn't make sense? And the golden age for this stuff, honestly, was the late 90s and early 2000s. This is why Stratfor got so popular. I don't know if you know this actually. So Stratfor took off well before my time with the Serbian invasion of Kosovo, and it took off because all of like the Serbian government data and all this government data, it was just online and not password protected. So these guys were just going and like reading like the Serbian government's websites and the websites for all these countries that had no idea that people could access that information. And that's how they were getting ahead of the news cycle, because they had actual access to the real stuff. You obviously can't do that anymore. So you have to rely on second and third order stuff and creating models and forecast and rubbing things against each other that way. But there was a time where, like that golden age in the 90s and early 2000s, where you could get your hands on more than you could have possibly imagined.
It's fantastic. You actually answered like 3 questions I had. So I want to talk about. Oh well, premature buzzer there. I want to talk about Spanx reading versus healthy reading. So when it comes to having a healthy body, we can eat well and exercise, or we can just put on Spanx. And yes, they make them for dudes. When reading, we can read an important 40-year-old book, or read in other disciplines to gain intellectual breadth that ends up paying off huge someday, just like eating vegetables instead of Dairy Queen. Or we can smash some tendies in a blizzard because it satisfies our primitive brain. So how do we avoid intellectual junk food and Spanx reading and instead read our veggies?
It's really hard. And honestly, my intellectual hygiene is not so great right now. I have a 2-year-old, and my wife is also pregnant with our next. And man, by the end of the day, after reading all this stuff, like all I want to do is turn on Netflix and chill. And that's the junk. And so even if I'm telling myself, oh, I'll watch the 3 Mile documentary, this is better than, like, no, it's like it's the same stuff. Like you're falling asleep 5 minutes in. But when my mental hygiene is good, and this answer might surprise some of your listeners, honestly, it's about finding good fiction first and foremost. Because I spend most of my day reading nonfiction, whether it's World Bank reports or policy studies on this or the other, this, that, or the other thing. But if you really want to understand the human condition and understand the decisions that people are making or get into the minds of people, fiction is our best tool for that. So when I'm doing well, like my day is spent doing the work and grinding and reading all the nonfiction stuff. And when I go to relax, it's not the chicken tendies, Netflix, Hunger Games sort of thing. It's like, what's a real book that like teaches me something about human beings or makes me think about human beings in a way that I wasn't before and forces me to get out of sort of the rat race of big macro data and actually experience things emotionally on a real level. Because that I think is the hardest thing to do and helps you keep perspective.
All right. So speaking of kind of your reading hygiene, one of the questions we always ask is your favorite book that is, or books that is at least 30 years old.
Yeah, you said when I was prepping for this that if I could cheat if I needed to choose something more recent, which maybe tells me something about your other guests. They need to be reading longer stuff. The book that taught me more about politics than
Exactly.
any other book uh, was All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. It's loosely based on the life of Huey Long, which also makes it especially, I think, relevant for the current. Not just, I mean, it's especially relevant in the United States, but if you want to understand populism anywhere, like this story and what it's about, like really helps you understand populism. So honestly, that's the one that made me go from like wanting to study biology to wanting to study history and politics. And it's usually it's not the first book I tell my analysts to read. Like I tell my analysts the first thing they have to read is Psychology of Intelligence Analysis by Richard Heuer, because it gives you sort of the framework of everything I talked about in terms of intelligence training. But if you really want to understand politics, like you can't do better than starting at All the King's Men.
Yeah, the Heuer book there, the like CIA like guidebook is, in my opinion, if you're an investor, that's absolute required reading. So fully endorse that. What tools do you use to help you read? So you talked about like the system you have in great detail, which is awesome because I'm always trying to get that level of details from people, and I usually can't. But do you have any other like digital tools, apps, sites, plugins, anything that you use that you think um, other people might find useful?
I would honestly ask your listeners to help me with tools. In some ways, I feel old fashioned here. So at Stratfor, we literally did all of this work via Thunderbird. So like we had entire teams whose job was to like log things into email and send things to lists and forward things to different lists. So you would just have these email folders that were hundreds, thousands of things long, and you could just browse through them really quickly and read things. And I was actually on a team that like we used interns mostly to do this. We called it World Watch. Like I spent my first 3 months at Stratfor doing World Watch, which was literally just go to these websites, copy and paste articles, send them to this list. And then somebody else was going through them and sort of sending them where they needed to go. And I remember we experimented with like page scraping software and all this stuff, and none of it worked nearly as well. And I still honestly do things pretty much the same way. I go through all these different websites. The only thing the big leap that we've made in the last year or two, and really this is a credit to Rob, we use Notion now as a database that harvests all this stuff. And it allows me to go back and forth between, okay, here's the prediction I made about this, or here's the deep dive report that I wrote about this. And I can link it back and forth, but I can also still toggle and create that feed level thing so that I can just really quickly sort of go through it, like, 100 items that I've logged in the past 2 weeks, or rank them by importance or rank them by country, whatever I'm looking for, and sort of go for it from there. But artificial intelligence has not gotten good enough for me yet to like rely on anything other than doing the work myself. I'll also say, like, I mean, it sounds silly to be copying and pasting or scraping this stuff into a database, but there is something about just the mechanical act of having to do that that puts the info in my head. Whereas if it was being scraped, like I never would have seen it in the first place. So in some sense, like having to skim and it's in the database, and then I have to go back and look at it later. Like it's already started planting seeds in my head. So I have not figured out a better way to do it than that rudimentary way. And I've been searching for years. And honestly, I have finally gotten to the point where it's like, it works for me, and it seems to, and Notion helps me make it communicable to like our clients or to other people. So that's what I do, but it's still a lot of just of grunt labor. My ideal day, like I wake up and I do 2 hours of this where I'm just reading the stuff that I want to have and logging it correctly and thinking about the world that way.
Perfect. And I've used Notion a little bit, and I know a lot of like futurists use it and kind of swear by it. Two things that since you called for help, I'll tell you two things that I use regularly that have both helped me. One is Speechify, and that is it just will read something to you online. It's incredibly good at it. I'll do that like a 1.8 speed using Snoop Dogg's voice to read to me because that's on there. And that's like, and it'll do like the little cursor to follow as you're reading through, which helps me because if not, I can't listen effectively. But if I'm watching and listening, I can do that. So if I'm just like trying to have lunch or something, instead of reading it, I'll just let it read to me, and it'll actually scroll down the web page, so you don't have to the whole time. So that's pretty sweet. And then, so I agree with AI. Like almost everything I was doing with AI, like just not good enough. And then I started to use Perplexity. And when they added the feature of like, hey, just paste in an article or drag in a PDF and then ask it questions. So I started doing that. And especially, so if it's something you need to go deep on, don't do it because it's not good enough at summarizing yet. Although there's hacks for that. But, if you have some 70-page, document from the Department of Energy talking about, transformers, and you're like, I kind of need to know this, but I don't want to read 70 pages. Like you throw it in, you're like, hey, summarize this for me. And then like 10 seconds later, it gives you a bunch of bullet points. And you're like, cool, I can move on with my day and save 2 hours, So those are two that I have for you, for listeners, that I think are worth, just kicking around, giving a shot to.
Yeah. There's one other one I should talk about, which also is a good sort of thing I should have said at the beginning, which is one of the most important things that I have to do in my process is find the original. So many of the articles that you read are like probably based on one press release or one report or something like that. I would ream out interns or other analysts that worked underneath me at my previous jobs if I got, the AP News or Reuters summary of the thing that happened. Like you have to go find the original. And that also means not being afraid of getting into Google Translate and finding the original. So many people get scared off by, I don't speak Chinese, I don't speak Farsi, there's no way I could understand. I don't speak that stuff either, but you can be pretty industrious and figure out what the original is and put it into Google Translate and get 75% of what you're talking about. And Google Translate is getting better every single day. So you will often like find me trying to find the original report that created a media firestorm, and usually you'll find it in some kind of local paper that is on page 7 or something like that got badly translated 2 different times, and then it made its way into a headline in like English speaking press a week later. Like that's a process that I'm always doing myself. So it is so important from a mental hygiene perspective. Find the original. Like if it's an article about a report, find the report, read the report, or identify very quickly if this is a report that's important or not, and why it's out, and who put it out, and what the message. Like that's a really, really important thing, and I think it separates a lot of analysts. It's why reading something like the Wall Street Journal or the Economist, that's fun. Honestly, that's the chicken tendies. Like it's relaxing. It's not hard. Like the hard thing is like, okay, go find like the stupid government report from Zambia that some economist intern found, and then 3 weeks later the economist decided to put some sort of spin on it. Like that's the hard stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, like it does get messed up along the way. Same with like technology stuff. That is like my favorite, to see something get extrapolated in the media, and then you go read about the real, the real ground truth of whatever that technology is, and it's like, oh yeah, maybe in 10 years this will kind of work, and the headline is like, oh, it sounds like it's imminent, so it's one of the things you mentioned there that, and it just does not get covered in the US is a lot of the stuff. You think about like a meeting between like Xi and Putin, where they will release like a 50 to 100 page readout or like something they put together after, and like literally not a mention of it in the Western media. And you realize like there's probably some like useful nuggets of information in the 100 pages they released about their meeting. And like you say, like we have this magic of Google Translate now. Why would you leave that laying around?
Well, meetings are actually complicated because most meetings are pointless, even ones between people like Putin and Xi. Like a lot, like so much groundwork has to be laid before you get to the point where a Putin and a Xi level figure are meeting. And meetings are also um, they're traps because they're easy for people to write about, even local journalists. So it's like, oh, something happened and we have a readout, so I don't have to actually do hard journalistic work to figure out what's going on. I can just summarize like whatever's in the release and something happened, and go have a beer rather than working hard on the article all the time. Now, I like to look at readouts, and if there's a huge divergence between how both sides are talking about the meeting, or if it's like the United States and China are at each other's throats, but the readouts are exactly the same. Like those types of things can tell you something really interesting. But for the most part, meetings are actually things that I try to stay away from. One of my least favorite weeks of the year is when the UN General Assembly meets in New York every September, because for a week we get nothing but, and so met on the sidelines of this, and so met on the sidelines of this. It's like everybody stopped doing real journalistic work for an entire week just to cover these bullshit meetings in the UN that don't actually like sort of come to anything. So that's another thing. Like I will take note of meetings and I'll do the parsing between the readouts, but I will always put more weight on, is this report telling me that something actually happened, versus, oh, they're telling me that two people talked about something and going from there. Because usually I know what Putin and Xi are going to say to each other if I've done my scenario work right.
Yeah, it's something else you kind of talked about. Maybe you definitely talked about it on the episode that I was citing earlier, but about the balance of confidence and humility. And that is super important for market operators. You have to know that everything's probabilistic and you'll lose roughly half the time, which means the humility side. We also have the guts to make and press bets when you see an opportunity, which is the confidence side. You have to have both and have to have the balance between, so like that cannot get out of kilter. Inevitably it will. You'll get too confident or too humble. How do you deal with those moments where you think you are geopolitical Nostradamus, or when you feel like no matter what you say, it will age as well as Portland taking Sam Bowie #2 in the '84 draft?
I have the opposite affliction. So I never think I'm geopolitical Nostradamus. If I have a problem, it's in being too humble. Like sometimes I need to check myself and be like, hey, like your humility is actually just hiding the fact that you're not willing to make a call, or that you need to do more work on this thing in order to get to a level of confidence. So for better and for worse, like hubris is not normally one of my problems. When I have made bad calls before, when I was fairly sure about something like Russia not invading Ukraine, um, it usually, or I mean, most of the calls that I'm thinking about right now, it's because I listened to somebody who said they had close access information, and I just didn't do the work because I was like, oh, like that's so. In the example of Russia, I've been to Moscow a couple times. I've spoken at a think tank associated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have, or I had. They haven't really talked to me since the invasion, but I had some Russian analyst friends who I really liked, who I went and drank vodka with, and shit talked Vladimir Putin with these guys in Moscow. Um, and to a T, they all said Russia's not invading. This is all political signaling. Like it's not. You don't need to worry about it. And I took that on face value because I was like, "Ooh, I'm important. I went to Moscow. I have these Russian analyst friends. Nobody else has my sourcing." Like that's usually when I get into trouble, and I sort of have to remind myself not to do that. But for me, it's the opposite. Like I will have a tendency to get too foxy, to invoke Philip Tetlock and say, like, but on this hand, I don't know, like that's eventually you do have to make a call one way or another. And if you really can't get to confidence, then that's not a trade you're going to put on, right? So
I definitely came to your work and stuck with it because of that. The fact that you don't have like insane conviction in everything you're doing, and saying like, that's what turns me off for people, whether it's in the markets or in geopolitics, or honestly any form of analysis. People that are too sure and they bend the probabilistic world to make it sound like that they have solved it. That's the people I just kind of leave alone. So while
well, and this is I'll toot my own horn here for a second and just say that this is what makes me unique. Because even Marco Papaciu, I love cousin Marco, and he's on my podcast all the time, and he should come on this podcast too. I'm happy to set y'all up if you haven't gotten in touch with him already. But like, I am the only one I know who's out here doing this, who like, I make my money by managing money for people and for myself. Like, I'm not out here, like, I hope to write a book and I do have a podcast, but like, that's not how I make money. Like, I make money off of actually managing assets. So when I'm wrong about something, I'm not just wrong, I'd lost money and my clients lost money, and it sobers you up real fast. Whereas even Marco, who's selling research, or even Peter, George, all these other guys, when they're wrong, they don't have skin in the game. They're not losing stuff, and that allows them to make calls that are sort of they don't have to worry about losing things that way. So it's also why, like the Mexico example here is really good. I very rarely work up enough conviction in something to feel very confident. Like, I can tell you on the Mexico thing, like, that's about as strong as I get to being sure about something, and watch it be completely wrong and like blow up in my face. That'll be the one
So,
that can come on the podcast.
what I'll say for myself is usually the most confident things for me tend to have a bad track record. Not to say all of them. Like, I've had some big winners that I happen to feel great about, but a lot of times if I feel real sure, like, I should probably just cut that position in half on the spot.
I don't know. There's something to gut instinct that is really important. I already mentioned Roger. He was the one who forced me to read Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. He also made a great metaphor at the beginning of my analysis training. He said, you should not think of this as a hard science, because it's not. And anybody who wants to treat it like a hard science, that's probably some underlying insecurity that they have about, not having gone and gotten a PhD in a hard science or something. This is much more like art. This is much more like pottery. Like, you're trying to make the piece of pottery into what it is, and it might collapse on itself, or you might have to do, like, it's more of an artisan type thing and something you do over time. So when the data and the analysis, and I've done all the work, and I have a gut feeling, like, usually when all those things come together, that's a good sign for me, because like, I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between when I'm clinging to something or when I'm being lazy versus like, no, like something here is right. So I wouldn't dismiss like gut intuition there when it comes to this sort of stuff.
Yeah, you're making me plug a book, the Dow Jones average. It really goes deep on the right brain versus left brain and markets. It's a really good read. That brings me to another question. I always, like, everyone that does the things we do, like, we all collect a lot of dots. We all read a ton. We all think a ton. That's not where the good ideas come from. They come from all those connections we make in our head later, usually while not at all doing that work. I told a story of this the other day, but in a lot of like ancient cultures and indigenous cultures, they wouldn't make big decisions unless they had thought about them both sober and drunk, because when you drink, it mutes the left side of your brain essentially, so it opens the creativity side. So if you thought about it on both and you still think that, then yeah, press forward. But obviously it doesn't have to be that. It could be a walk in the woods, or just while you're taking your Churchillian bath in the morning or something. Like, the question is, how do you find that you most often tend to come up with those ideas where the dots connect themselves in your head?
So I'm a swimmer. I swim like almost 2 miles every other day, and most of the stuff that I write is written in my head in the pool. Like, I get back from the pool and it pours out of my fingertips. That's usually where all of it comes together. Not, by the way, playing basketball or anything like that, because that, like, you're like paying attention to the team stuff. Like, it's the solitary, I'm in the pool for an hour, the heart is up, like that's where I write most of my best stuff.
You're focused on the team stuff. Everyone else is trying to figure out how they can score 20. But so last question, and you brought up your grandparents a couple of times. I heard you talk about your dad on the podcast after he passed. Talk to us about your grandparents and the role they played.
Well, I honestly, I come from two very strange sets of grandparents. So my dad's parents were Holocaust survivors. They sort of grew up in what is today present-day Ukraine, but it was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth when they were born. They moved to Vienna, both of them very young, and my grandmother's family sold liquor in Vienna, was very successful. So if World War II hadn't happened, I'd be a Viennese liquor salesman rather than a trader. And it's okay. Hopefully, the Austrian government will process my application for citizenship at some point here. They've only been thinking about it for the last 12 months. But they thought that France was a good place to escape the Nazis to, and that was obviously a bad decision. My grandfather fought in the French army for as long as it lasted, and then they slowly made their way to Switzerland. And there's sort of an epic story of how they ended up in a Swiss displaced persons camp. Most of my family did not make it, so he had some sort of gumption for how to get around and sort of get in. And they waited it out in Switzerland. They moved back to France. My dad was born there, and then when he was 3 months old, they came across the Atlantic, and they were in New York. And my grandfather started up a little luncheonette, and I mean, a true rag to riches sort of American immigrant story. My mother's parents were waspy socialites from Washington, D.C. And my grandfather, I don't know if you can maybe see it in the screen behind me. The listeners won't be able to see it, but my grandfather on my mother's side flipped a coin with a young naval officer named John F. Kennedy for who was going to get PT Boat 110 and who was going to get PT Boat 111. I think, or was it 112? I forget exactly. But anyway, he flipped a coin. He wrote an article about this that was published in a lot of different places. And he always joked that, if the coin had gone the other way, he would have been the war hero and maybe he would have been the president of the United States. But so, very different backgrounds. And I would give anything to have been at my parents' wedding to watch my sort of, Holocaust survivor, Marxist, atheist, country bumpkin, like dad's parents with these like waspy socialite, rubbing shoulders with Supreme Court justices and presidents and stuff like that on the other side, and watching them hang out together. But so I'm this weird mix of privilege on one side and, starting with nothing on the other side. And those two parts of my brain, I was actually thinking about this on a run the other day, like those two parts of my brain do battle a lot in my personal life and also in my analytical life. And I think it helps me because I can do the sort of top down, powerful, wealthy, educated political class analysis, but I can also do the bottoms up, like something is weird here, or there's something more primordial coming up from the surface, and it's always constantly going back and forth. So we're all products, I guess, of our past, or maybe not. I actually find that most people don't even know like where their grandparents are from, whereas I know very minute details about both sides because I'm a product of those two strange lineages.
That's fantastic. I hope a lot of people are still listening because that's too good. If not, I'm going to find a way to shove that down everyone's throat. So that's all I have for you today. I definitely hope you'll be a regular on the show. I want you to be a staple. But let my listeners know where they can find you and how they can get access to your great work.
Yeah. So, so it's Cognitive Dissidence is the podcast, but we're actually, Chase, we're going to rename it to the Jacob Shapiro podcast, in part because everybody stumbles over the name, including you when you introduced it, because it's a great pun on paper, but like when I'm at a conference speaking, they're like, cognitive what? Also, I'll step on the story here. I got a cease and desist email from some Mormon group that claimed that they had a Cognitive Dissidence podcast first. So we're going to change it to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. And this is really great. So it turns out there's another Jacob Shapiro at Princeton University who does Middle Eastern politics and stuff like that. So I'm going to Princeton in 2 weeks to interview him in person for the first episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. We will have two Jacob Shapiros talking to each other. So be on the lookout for the Jacob Shapiro podcast, probably by the time this posts. And then you could find more information about me, either jacobshapiro.com or cognitive.investments. Our website's getting a little bit of a freshening up, but hopefully by the time your listeners listen to this, they'll be able to find cognitive.investments. But if not, jacobshapiro.com. I bought jacobshapiro.com in like 2019 or 2020, and it was a good investment. I thought very hard about changing my name at the time, and part of me wishes that I had. I was thinking about going for my mother's maiden name. Because Ben Shapiro's out there, and I get asked every single time I give a speech, like, "Are you related to Ben Shapiro?" And I hope one day to be important enough that Ben Shapiro will consent to being eviscerated in a debate with me about a topic of his choosing. Let's fucking go, Ben. But for now, it's Jacob Shapiro.
Oh man, that's great. And hey, maybe TaylorMade Macro will be big enough. We'll host that podcast.
I would love that. Or we can get
or at least get the Peter Zeihan debate maybe.
Yeah, I would love to do that too.
We'll line up the debates.
I would love to do that too. I've had this idea about an event that was just like debates for because you probably go to a lot of conferences. I go to so many conferences, and like I speak at conferences, and I think I'm a pretty good speaker. But I'm waiting for the conference that is willing to do like debate style stuff, where it's like a debate on on an issue between two different speakers for like 4 different topics throughout the course of the day, rather than just like, everybody droning on from their deck. So whether it's you or somebody else out there, like let me know when you want to do that event, because I'll take whatever view you want. I'm happy to take the opposite side.
So we'll break some news here. We do want to start having live events, and so I would love to do it that way. And you're, of course, high on the list to be on that, because I don't really know any other geopolitical people that I trust or care for enough, probably. So maybe it's the intelligence analyst background. Like I think we have some of those same fundamentals. So, but yeah, I really do want to do some in-person stuff, and I agree. Like the same old panels where everyone says the same stuff. It's just kind of boring. The key is just to get a bunch of people that aren't politically charged tribalists, so that you can have a thoughtful, intellectual debate instead of annoying stuff.
Well, this actually, I mean, I know we're trying to get out of here, but I mean, this goes back to the point about humility and confidence, because you actually need people who are willing to be that strong about something politically and argue, go for the jugular, like tooth and nail, completely passionately. And then like when the session is over, be like, hey, let's have a beer. I don't care that we took the exact opposite view, which is me. I mean, to give you an anecdote of this was even before my career, so it tells you that I was sort of made for this. I took the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Cornell with a friend of mine. This, it's we joke that it's job security, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It wasn't. It's worse now, but it's not like it was great then. Anyway, so we had a discussion section for the class once a week, and so my friend and I, beforehand, we would always pick who was going to be pro-Israeli and who was going to be pro-Palestinian in that discussion section. And that TA had no idea what to do with himself, because one week I'd show up railing against the IDF and how they were killing babies, and the next week I'd be railing against the Palestinians and how they're all terrorists. I love the debate. That's what's most fun.
Yeah, this kind of the law school vibe. It's kind of perfect, and to put people in those positions, put yourself in that position. You should always be wargaming your own stuff anyway. All right, Jacob, thanks so much, and we'll do it again soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Chase.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. And remember, nothing we said today was investment advice, just our thoughts on markets, which are likely to change from the time of recording. Please check out our detailed show notes, the transcript, links, etc. via the podcast tab at pineconemacro.com. We'll be back soon with another great thinker we can all learn from. Cheers.